The widow at the river's edge. The story opens by immersing the reader in Eliza's quiet, grief-shaped world, a place defined more by absence than by action. Eliza is introduced as a woman suspended in time, living on the margins of a small frontier town where her identity has narrowed to a single word: widow. 2 years after her husband's death, grief has not faded. Instead, it has settled into her bones, dictating her routines and dulling her expectations for the future. The river beside her modest home becomes a powerful symbol in this opening part. It flows onward while her life remains still, reflecting her internal conflict between the inevitability of time and her inability to move forward. Third, townspeople, once polite and attentive, now pass her by with practiced indifference, reinforcing her loneliness and sense of invisibility. This emotional isolation prepares the ground for the story's central disruption, the arrival of Ian. His appearance is deliberately quiet yet commanding, marked by physical scars and a stillness that suggests a man shaped by violence, duty, and restraint. He does not intrude upon Eliza's space with force or bravado. Instead, his hesitation and silence mirror her own guarded nature, creating an unspoken understanding between them before words are exchanged. When he finally speaks, his voice carries urgency beneath controlled calm, signaling that this meeting is not accidental, but driven by forces larger than either of them. His presence instantly alters the emotional landscape of the scene, introducing tension, mystery, and the promise of upheaval. Importantly, Part 1 does not yet reveal the full nature of his plea. Instead, it focuses on the emotional collision between two wounded lives at a moment of profound vulnerability. Eliza's reaction and ease, mixed with a flicker of curiosity, marks the first crack in her emotional armor. For the first time since her husband's death, something unexpected enters her carefully contained world, threatening the fragile balance she has built around her grief. This opening part establishes the story's central themes of time, loss, and reluctant hope, setting up the 7-day countdown not merely as a plot device, but as a symbolic challenge to Eliza's decision to remain untouched by life. By ending Part 1 on the brink of confession, the narrative invites the reader to lean forward, aware that once the truth is spoken, neither the widow nor the warrior will be able to return to who they were before this meeting. By the river's edge. The warrior's confession. The story shifts from quiet observation to emotional revelation, deepening the tension introduced in the opening scene. This part centers on Ian finally breaking his silence and exposing the true reason for his sudden appearance in Eliza's life. His confession is not delivered dramatically, but with solemn restraint, emphasizing his honor and the cultural weight behind his words. He explains that he is bound by an ancient Cherokee clan law tied to bloodline, land inheritance, a law that demands he marry before the next full moon or forfeit land entrusted to him by his ancestors. This inheritance is not framed as wealth, but as responsibility, representing continuity, protection, and the survival of his people's legacy. The 7-day limit immediately introduces urgency and a ticking clock, transforming the story from a quiet character study into a race against time. Eliza's role in this part is equally important. She is not portrayed as a convenient solution, but as an unexpected possibility that fate itself seems to have placed before him. Her reaction is layered: shock, suspicion, and disbelief clash with a reluctant empathy. She has learned to distrust sudden changes, especially those involving men and promises. And the idea that she might be chosen out of desperation wounds her pride, even as it stirs something long dormant. This part carefully avoids romanticization. Ian does not speak of love, and Eliza does not imagine it. Instead, their interaction is grounded in stark honesty. His eyes betray fear not of losing property, but of failing his ancestors, and this distinction is crucial, as it reframes his plea as one rooted in duty rather than self-interest. Eliza, still raw from grief, sees in him a mirror of her own loss, a person trapped by obligations to the past. The confession forces her to confront a truth she has avoided, that her isolation is a choice she has been clinging to for safety. Part 2 also subtly introduces cultural contrast and mutual respect. Ian speaks carefully, aware of the strangeness of his request, while Eliza listens not as a passive recipient, but as a woman weighing the cost of involvement. By the end of this part, nothing is resolved, yet everything has changed. The confession binds them together through knowledge and vulnerability, establishing the central conflict of the story, whether two people, shaped by loss and duty, can risk forming a bond that begins not with love, but with necessity. The reader is left understanding that the 7 days ahead will not merely determine inheritance, but whether Eliza dares to step back into life itself. A bargain made in silence. The story slows its pace to explore the fragile space between refusal and acceptance, where true emotional decisions are formed. After Weeze's confession, Eliza does not answer him outright, and this restraint is crucial to her character. She has survived by thinking carefully, by never leaping where she cannot see the ground. Death's part emphasizes what is left unsaid, showing how silence becomes its own form of negotiation. Rather than dismissing him or agreeing out of pity, Eliza allows him to stay the night. A small but significant act that reveals her internal conflict. Their shared evening is marked by simple gestures: food placed on the table, a fire tended, stories exchanged in fragments which quietly replace fear with familiarity. Through these moments, the narrative highlights how grief has shaped both of them into people who value respect over passion and truth over comfort. When Wiz speaks of fallen brothers and the burden of survival, while Eliza reflects on how widowhood stripped her not only of love, but of purpose. No formal terms are spoken, yet an unspoken understanding begins to form. If this marriage happens, it will be built on mutual consent, not coercion. Where the idea of a bargain emerges, not a legal or spoken agreement, but an emotional one rooted in dignity. Eliza begins to realize that his presence does not demand anything from her beyond consideration, and that alone disarms her defenses. The morning light serves as a symbolic turning point, representing clarity after uncertainty. When Eliza finally says she will consider it, the words carry weight far beyond their simplicity. They mark the first time since her husband's death that she has allowed the future to exist as something other than empty space. For Weeze, her response is not a victory, but a responsibility. Her hesitation earns his respect, deepening the trust between them. Part 3 is essential because it transforms the story's premise from a desperate request into a shared crossroads. The ticking clock becomes real, but so does the emotional risk. By the end of this part, the bargain, though still undefined, binds them together in intention, setting the foundation for the days ahead where choice, not obligation, will decide their fate. 7 days of learning. The story moves from uncertainty into gradual connection, showing how time once an enemy begins to soften into opportunity. This part focuses on the everyday moments that quietly reshape Eliza's and Weeze's perceptions of one another. With the bargain still unspoken and the deadline looming. Neither treats the days as courtship, yet intimacy grows through shared labor and mutual respect. Weeze repairs broken fencing, chops wood, and tends to tasks without asking for thanks. Actions that speak louder than promises. For Eliza, these gestures are unsettling because they contradict her belief that dependence always leads to loss. Watching him move through her space with care rather than dominance allows her to feel safe in a way she has not since her husband's death. In turn, Weeze observes Eliza's strength in quiet resilience, how she manages her household alone, how she endures the town's sideways glances, and how she carries grief without letting it harden into bitterness. This part also introduces external pressure, through gossip and suspicion from townsfolk, reminding both characters that their tentative bond exists within a judgmental world. Rather than driving them apart, this scrutiny subtly pushes them closer, forming a private alliance against misunderstanding. Emotionally, Part 4 marks the shift from survival to curiosity. Eliza begins to wonder what life might look like if she were not always bracing for loss, while Weeze starts to imagine a future where duty and personal peace are not in conflict. The ticking 7-day limit becomes less about desperation and more about revelation, each day teaching them something essential about trust, patience, and shared humanity. Importantly, this part resists sudden romance. Affection grows slowly, grounded in observation and respect rather than passion. By the end of Part 4, both characters are changed in small but irreversible ways. The The agreement that once felt like a transaction now carries emotional weight, and the reader senses that even if the marriage never happens, neither Eliza nor Anne Wees can return to the guarded solitude they inhabited before these 7 days of learning began. Blood ties and old wounds, the story widens its scope. Shifting from the private world, Eliza and Anne Wees have begun to build into the larger, more demanding realm of heritage, responsibility, and consequence. This part marks a pivotal turning point. As Eliza is brought face-to-face with the true weight of Anne Wees' inheritance and the people it affects, Jet. When he takes her to his people's land, the journey itself feels ceremonial, carrying her beyond the boundaries of her familiar life and into a space shaped by centuries of tradition. The elders' presence introduces quiet tension. They do not judge Eliza by appearance or status, but by her spirit, her attentiveness, and her willingness to listen. For Eliza, this scrutiny is deeply unsettling, not because it is hostile, but because it is purposeful. She realizes she is being considered as part of something enduring, not temporary. During this visit, the emotional stakes rise when she learns the full truth behind the 7-day deadline. The inheritance is not a personal reward, but a safeguard. The land carries strategic and spiritual importance, and without Anne Wees' rightful claim, rival factions could exploit its vulnerability, threatening both peace and lives. This revelation reframes everything Eliza thought she understood. What once seemed like a desperate personal plea now reveals itself as a communal responsibility thing, and she grapples with the terrifying realization that her choice could ripple far beyond her own happiness or fear. At the same time, this part exposes An's deepest wound, the burden of being the last bearer of his father's line, carrying expectations that leave no room for weakness or delay. His warrior strength is contrasted with quiet exhaustion, showing that duty has cost him dearly. Eliza's widowhood and his inherited obligation mirror each other here, both rooted in blood ties they did not choose, yet cannot escape. Emotionally, Part 5 deepens Eliza's internal conflict. Agreeing to marriage now feels less like self-preservation and more like surrendering her autonomy to forces she barely understands. Yet, refusing feels equally heavy, as it would mean turning away from lives placed unknowingly in her hands. By the end of this part, Eliza is no longer deciding whether she can risk loving again. She is deciding whether she is willing to step into a role defined by legacy, sacrifice, and belonging. This chapter transforms the story from an intimate slow-burn romance into a moral crossroads, where personal healing collides with ancestral duty and where the cost of saying yes or no becomes equally profound. Fear before the vow, the story turns inward, confronting the emotional breaking point that often comes just before irrevocable change. This part is driven almost entirely by Eliza's fear, not of Anne Wees himself, but of what choosing him would mean for her sense of self and hard-earned independence. After learning the true stakes of the inheritance, the weight of responsibility becomes suffocating. Marriage no longer feels like a tentative agreement between two wounded people. It feels like a permanent binding to grief, duty, and a future she cannot fully control. Old wounds, resurface memories of loving deeply, trusting completely, and then being left alone when death tore her world apart. The prospect of opening her heart again awakens a terror more powerful than loneliness, the fear of surviving another loss. This part captures the instinct to flee when healing demands courage. Eliza's decision to pack her belongings before dawn is not cowardice, but self-preservation. A desperate attempt to reclaim control before fate seals her path. When Louise discovers her preparing to leave, the emotional tension reaches its peak. For the first time, his composed warrior exterior fractures, revealing vulnerability rather than command. Crucially, his response is not anger or persuasion. Instead, he offers her freedom. By stating that he would rather lose his inheritance than bind her unwillingly, he dismantles Eliza's deepest fear that she is merely a means to an end. This moment reframes his character entirely, proving that honor, for him, is not tradition alone, but the protection of another's choice. His confession shifts the power dynamic, placing Eliza not under obligation, but in a position of true agency. Emotionally, this part functions as the story's crucible. Fear is named, exposed, and challenged by honesty. Eliza realizes that what frightens her most is not becoming his wife. but becoming alive again, accepting a future that includes hope and vulnerability. Part 6 does not resolve her decision, but it clears away the lies she has told herself to remain safe. B. The end of this chapter, the reader understands that if Elisa stays, it will not be out of pity, pressure, or fear of consequences, but because she chooses to believe that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt. This sets the stage for a vow that will be made not in desperation, but in courage. Stay's promise. The story reaches its emotional and thematic culmination, where time, choice, and identity finally converge. Dawn on the seventh day is heavy with meaning, symbolizing both an ending and a beginning. Eliza's decision to stay is not framed as a sudden realization or romantic impulse, but as a quiet, resolute acceptance of risk. 2. Having faced her fear in the previous part, she now understands that avoiding pain has also meant avoiding life. Choosing Anne Wees is therefore less about becoming a wife and more about reclaiming her ability to choose connection over isolation. The ceremony itself is deliberately simple, reflecting the values that have guided both characters throughout the story. Debts. There is no grandeur, only intention, hands joined beneath ancient trees, vows spoken in 2 languages, and silence that carries more meaning than celebration. This blending of Cherokee tradition and Eliza's world symbolizes the union not just of 2 people, but of histories and futures that once ran parallel. For Anne Wees, this day is the release of a burden he has carried alone. The inheritance is secured, but more importantly, it is no longer a solitary responsibility. His expression of gratitude is understated, reinforcing that this union was never about winning, but about mutual willingness. Emotionally, Part 7 reframes the 7-day deadline that once loomed like a threat. Plea. What began as a countdown rooted in loss becomes a measure of growth, proving that meaningful bonds do not require long histories, only honesty and respect. Eliza's transformation is especially clear here. She stands not as a rescued widow or a reluctant bride, but as an equal partner, stepping into a shared future with open eyes. 2. The promise made on this day is not eternal happiness, but commitment to truth, to effort, and to facing hardship together. By the end of Part 7, the story resolves its central conflict without erasing its complexities. Love is not declared loudly, yet it is undeniably present, shaped by shared vulnerability rather than fantasy. The reader is left with a sense of earned resolution, understanding that while the past cannot be undone, it can be honored without dictating the future. This 7th-day promise transforms a plea born of desperation into a vow grounded in choice, dignity, and hope. Beyond time's chains, the story settles into reflection, showing the lasting consequences of a choice made under pressure and the quiet rewards that follow courage. This final part moves beyond the urgency of the 7-day deadline and allows time to stretch naturally, emphasizing that while the story began with constraint, it ends in freedom. Months after the marriage, Eliza's life is no longer defined by grief or counting days since loss. Instead, she measures time by growth, by seasons changing on the land, by shared work, and by moments of unspoken understanding. Her widowhood does not vanish. It becomes part of her history rather than her identity. This transformation underscores one of the story's core messages. Healing does not erase pain, but it reshapes it into something survivable. For Anne Wees, the secured inheritance brings stability. But more importantly, it restores balance between duty and personal peace. The land thrives under protection, rival threats recede, and the burden he once carried alone is now shared, not as obligation but as partnership. Their marriage evolves slowly, rooted in the same respect that first drew them together. Love emerges not as dramatic passion, but as steady presence trust, built through daily choices rather than grand declarations. Part 8 also reframes the story's title, Bound by Blood and Time, revealing that these forces no longer imprison the characters but anchor them. Blood becomes lineage honored rather than obligation feared, and time becomes a companion instead of an enemy. Eliza, once frozen in grief, now moves forward without denying her past, while Anne Wees learns that strength can coexist with tenderness. The closing tone is intentionally gentle, offering resolution without perfection. There are no promises that life will be easy, only the assurance that it will be shared. By ending on this note, the story affirms that even relationships born from necessity can grow into something deeply chosen. Through what began as a plea driven by urgency becomes a life shaped by intention, proving that the most meaningful bonds are not always formed in ideal circumstances, but in moments where two people dare to step beyond fear and allow time to transform survival into belonging.